Lori Osborne, and I'm the director of the Frances Willard House Museum. And this program today is part of our Views on Women's History series. And we're really excited to bring them to you via Zoom, though we'd love to see you in Evanston sometime too. But we know we can reach so many people this way from all different places. So it's actually a wonderful benefit of learning how to do this in pandemic times. And we can have speakers who don't live nearby, but today we didn't have to do that. Lucy is from Evanston too, so that's wonderful. So this year our theme for the Views series is Women, Faith, and Activism. And we're going to be discussing how the religious faith of many women activists influenced or motivated their activism. And we're going to hear more about this theme during the program, and be sure to stay connected to us as the series will continue in 2022 with yet to be determined group of speakers, though we will probably be speaking with the author of the upcoming biography of Frances Willard that will be coming out later. I'm not sure what year, but we'll let you know that too. But we'll probably be speaking with him at some point, and then we have a couple of other ideas too. So stay tuned on who that will be. But today we're going to be focusing on an earlier time period and pre-Frances Willard's time. So in case you're unaware, I want to just give you a little bit of background and some housekeeping. The Frances Willard House Museum is home to Frances Willard, 19th century suffragist and social reformer. Willard was the longtime president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the largest organization of women in the world by 1890. You can find out more about her home, her life, and the WCTU on our website, franceswillardhouse.org. We're now open for tours in the house, and you can make an appointment to use our research room and archives. And we welcome your visit to Evanston, but of course, online you can also find lots of our stories on our website, and lots of things about women's history, women in this time, the 19th century, and activism. If you don't already get our newsletter, be sure to go to our website and sign up, and follow us on social media too, so you can stay connected and know what we're up to. You can also make a donation on the website to support our work and this talk if you'd like to. For this year, all our programs will remain free, but we are encouraging those who are able to make a donation to do so. And a link Fiona has posted in the chat. So thank you, Fiona, for doing that. So like I said, we're going to be creating a video. We've turned everyone off and turned off your video feeds to make that possible. We'll have about 40 minutes of conversation and time for questions. So as you think of questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll come back to them. You can also save them for the end too, if you like, but it's okay to just go ahead and write them in the chat, and we'll hold on to them. And I mentioned that Fiona Maxwell, Museum Operations Manager at the Willard House, is behind the scenes making sure everything's running smoothly. So thank you, Fiona, for doing that, and she'll watch those chat questions. So let me introduce our speaker today, Louise W. Knight, who I know as Lucy, is an author and lecturer and a historian. She's written 2 biographies of Jane Addams: Citizen, Jane Addams and the Struggle for Democracy, University of Chicago Press, 2005, and Jane Addams, Spirit in Action, Norton Press, in 2010. Her writings have been published widely, and she lectures often at universities, historical societies, and in academic conferences. And in her lectures and other writings, she explores the connections between early and current progressive civic action. She's a longtime visiting scholar in the Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Northwestern University here in Evanston, and is a former board member of the Frances Willard Historical Association, so connected to us in many ways. And we're really glad to have Lucy here today to talk about her upcoming book, about Angelina and Sarah Grimke. And so let's get started. So, Lucy, maybe just start with a little bit about how this project started for you and give everyone a little bit of background on Angelina and Sarah, just in case they're not familiar with the basics of their biographies and lives.
Okay, well, thank you, Lori, very much for the invitation to be part of this Zoom today. And thank you, everyone, for coming. It's wonderful. You know, authors sit in their rooms and write, and they don't get to talk about the people they're writing about too often while they're writing the book. So they're kind of up to here with things to say. So I'm very glad to be here and to talk. So I will tell you a little bit about the Grimkes first, and then how I decided to write about them. Sarah and Angelina Grimke were born in Charleston, South Carolina in the Sarah was late 18th century, Angelina early 19th century. And so they really were coming of age at a time when women were not doing much of anything. The main things women were allowed to do were write poetry and publish it anonymously. Sometimes they ran schools. That was a breakthrough achievement. And so the examples that the sisters had of what women could do were very limited. And that's part of the story of what they achieved, since they became immediate abolitionists and women's rights advocates in their 30s and 40s. The story of how they did that, how did they go from being privileged aristocrats with very limited opportunities for any kind of education, although they could read in their father's library, which was tremendous, to becoming famous on the lecture circuit. They were the first women to speak about a particular social reform on the lecture circuit. Frances Wright was an earlier lecturer than they, but she was doing it in the education mode. They were doing it in the reform mode. And so I find their story fascinating. How I decided to write about them is also how I first learned about them is relevant to that. I was teaching a course in 19th century women's radical rhetoric at Northwestern, and a speech by Angelina was included in a textbook of women's speeches that I used for the course. And I was like, who is this person? So I went and read Gerda Lerner's biography of the sisters, which was the first biography by a historian of them, which came out in the late 1960s. And really everyone was blown away, and everyone was reading it, but I didn't, because I didn't know about it. But I was in college, so I didn't stumble on it. But I read her biography, and I was like tremendously impressed. Then I forgot about them. And then after I finished the Adams books, I was trying to think what I wanted to do next. I knew I wanted to write another biography. I also knew I wanted it to be people who were at least as radical as Adams, and she was more radical than many people realize, but maybe even more radical, because Adams was a very subtle persuader, and a part of me really likes blunt, honest radicalism. So that's about as far as I'd figured it out. And then I went to a conference for biographers, and they had some editors on a panel, and they were talking about what I thought was a silly subject, which is, what is the best title, like titles that entice or something. And they said, oh, books that have the word sisters in the title are good. So I was like disdainful of the insight, but it got me thinking. So then I went, well, I'm trying to think of someone who to write about. And I thought, well, do I know any sisters? And then I suddenly remembered the Grimke sisters. And I realized, of course, that's who I want to write about, because I knew Gerda Lerner's book was of pretty limited value, even though it was tremendously groundbreaking. It was short. It was, short on a lot of the citations she needed to give. And now I know a lot more about its limitations. But anyway, that's how I decided. They fit everything I wanted. They were more radical. They went back in time, which appealed to me a lot. I wasn't going to do another progressive era person. Mm-hmm. And very important to biographers, there has to be a ton of original material to work with if you're going to be able to write anything of interest and substance that has grounded in the reality of their lives. And the Grimke sisters, there's probably the best I mean, there are very few people whose documentation is rich as theirs, because, you know, presidents have all their public letters, but, you know, they kept diaries for a significant period of their lives. They wrote copious letters that are a great pleasure to read because they were so smart and articulate, et cetera, et cetera. So they're kind of the perfect subjects from my point of view.
Yeah, that's so fascinating, Lucy, to hear how you um, work as a writer and coming to the new topic, but sort of in like a serendipitous way. You know, sometimes it just sort of happens, but then it's like clearly, oh, this is it. This is landed in my lap, and it's the ideal for many reasons, which you note. I love that. Um, in keeping with our theme, maybe is there anything else that would be important to know about their time period that they're living? And maybe a little about what's going on in Christianity and what's going on, you know, just a little bit. Is there anything else about their time? And then about them that helps to illuminate that the issue of around faith in their early life or as they're growing up, or anything there that might help us understand a little bit about their time.
So the sisters grew up in Charleston, and as aristocrats, they belonged to the Episcopal Church because, you know, after the Revolution, the Anglican Church in the United States became the Episcopal Church. And they attended the, you know, elite. There were two elite Episcopal churches, and they grew up that way. But they also were growing up in what historians have called the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening was in the middle of the 18th century, when an emphasis on personal conversion experience and taking Christ into your heart and admitting your sinfulness in a very deeply personal way first emerged in New England, although there were evangelical ministers coming over from England to the South as well. And there was a much more greater emphasis on preaching, and it was emotionally exciting, which was very different than the staid, you know, formalized services of some of the church denominations in the United States. And the Baptists were just emerging, the Methodists were just emerging. So that was a very exciting period in the 18th century. And in the 19th century, these denominations began to grow by going outside institutional buildings, because the pioneers were all in fields. They didn't have churches. And there was a great concern about Americans not being churched, not having a minister in their midst. So these itinerant ministers would travel. Of course, the sisters were in Charleston, so they were, you know, very much oriented around church buildings, but they took journeys, both of them, through various denominations. Because of the excitement and energy that was going on outside the Episcopal Church, we have to say, they did eventually get an Episcopalian evangelical minister in a new church that was founded, that their father and their brother went to, but it was still Episcopalian. So the sisters moved through Presbyterianism. Angelina joined. They dabbled in Methodism, and then they settled on Quakerism for a series of very particular reasons. But I should add that the Quakers were also evangelical. This is not well understood. Historians have sometimes called the evangelical Christians over here and the Quakers over there, but that's not correct. They were evangelical also, although their mode of worship was very different, but their theology and ideas was evangelical.
Yeah.
So I would say the sisters lived in a deeply religious time, a time where many people, not all by any means, but many people were searching in a very earnest and committed way to find the faith that best mirrored their own beliefs. And so the sisters were not unusual in their journey through these various denominations. Many people did that, not everyone, but many people. And so it was a time where the atmosphere around you was, what do you believe as a Christian? And now I am talking just about Christianity, obviously. There were Jewish people in Charleston. There were Muslims elsewhere. But Protestant Christianity was their world. But it was it was a very exciting time to be a Protestant Christian.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time period. It really sort of sets the stage for what else comes in the 19th century too. Um, so just so everyone knows a time frame, place place them in time. So they are the generation before some women activists who people might know, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They're
Yeah,
the
actually,
generation just
yeah. The
just prior.
generations are a little bit shorter than you would think. So
Yeah, yeah,
Susan B. Anthony is 2 generations away, and Sarah and Angelina are 14 years apart in age. So
yeah,
Angelina is almost young enough to be Sarah's daughter and is in many ways nearly a different generation than Sarah, who grew up with a bunch of older brothers who were deeply 18th century people. Um, so the here's the way to frame it. When Angelina and Sarah went forth as abolitionist lecturers in 1836, 37, one of the young women in their audience in Massachusetts was Lucy Stone, who was a young woman.
yeah,
She already knew she was going to become a feminist, but she didn't have anything to work with. She
yeah,
had it in her gut. And
yeah,
when she, encountered the Grimke sisters and their writings, she was like, of course. So she was, I don't know, 18, 19, whatever, when they were speaking in their 30s and 40s.
yeah,
And then Lucy Stone was older than Susan B. Anthony by quite a bit. So,
yeah.
Stone died in the 80s. Anthony died in 1900, I don't know what, 9 or
Six or
something.
seven. Yeah,
So, so these generations are quite spread out. These guys, the Grimke sisters, are the earliest early. There aren't,
yep,
other than Frances Wright, who was an unusual phenomenon in American and women's history, they're the first. I mean,
yeah.
Lucretia Mott is there as a prominent Quaker interested in abolitionism, but she has not yet given a single speech outside the Quaker world when the Grimkes do.
Yep. And just so everyone, since we talk about Frances Willard is born at that time in 1838. So she isn't even alive when they're giving those speeches and Lucy Stone is attending. So she's the next or even the third or fourth generation afterwards. So that's a little bit of just, it's always, to me, that just helps me understand where they fit in kind of a larger narrative. So I always like to kind of rehearse that timeline. So Lizzie, you've mentioned a couple of things that are really important, but maybe you can talk about the Grimke family and their relation to slavery, and then why the sisters reject that system, right? Why their rejection of slavery is thorough and a real change in their family dynamic, and go over that a little bit. And then what comes first? There's this exploration of faith that you've sort of outlined, or rejection of slavery, or is it happening at the same time? Is it part of the same conversation they're having with themselves?
Well, that's a lot to answer,
I
and
know, I
I'll
know.
take it in some pieces.
Yeah,
So, I mean, the underlying question you're asking there, because of the theme we're dealing with, women and faith and activism, is the sisters were increasingly devout Christians, and they were raised in a Christian family. And their father died, in 1819, but the mother became an evangelical Christian and joined the same church that Angelina was a member of. And so she was a devout Christian, which drove Angelina crazy once she had arrived at her beliefs about slavery. So what happened, and what I'm trying to say is that just because you're a devout Christian didn't mean that you didn't think slavery was fine. And one of the big challenges for us as modern people is to understand how that could be. And it was also Sarah's and Angelina's challenge, because once they saw that slavery was a sin, which carried a huge amount of weight to them, right? I mean,
mhm,
we don't talk too much about sin anymore, but it meant you were going to hell when you die if you continue to sin. It was a very serious thing for devout Christians. And so when they decided from reading Quaker writings, because the Quakers said owning slavery was a sin, none of the other denominations are willing to go that far. The ministers themselves in the Presbyterian Church owned slaves if they lived in the South. Same for Methodism. That was the pressure that kept the churches from going all the way to owning slavery as a sin, because those ministers wouldn't let them say it in the national meetings. So when the sisters embraced Quakerism, they were basically rejecting the lifestyle of their family and challenging their mothers in particular, the legitimacy of her faith. Because they were saying, if you really believe Christianity, you would know that owning slaves like you do is a sin. And she refused to accept that because she would have to stop owning human beings if she accepted that. So for me, the challenge, and for the sisters, the challenge was saying, how can you believe that you are a devout Christian and still think owning human beings is acceptable? Mm-hmm. And in a way, there's no answer to that question, because anyone who's, read the words of Jesus knows that, he believed in the golden rule, treat others as you should be treated. And obviously that wasn't happening in the case of owning slaves. So at its core, it was just irreconcilable. But slave owners had a lot of ways of rationalizing their practice of enslavement. And one of them was the Bible verses about the practice of slavery in the Jewish history, which is the Old Testament. Yeah. And so there were ways to work around it. How did the sisters embrace Quakerism is, I guess, the question now. And because it was that step in their faith that brought them to understanding slavery was a sin, which is to say, what was their attitude before that? So their attitude was they didn't like the pain, the anguish, the humiliation that the people they lived with underwent because those people were being owned by their parents. They witnessed vicious whippings. They witnessed regular humiliation because slave owners would talk down to the people they enslaved and insult them verbally. There's a story that Angelina tells about her mother leaning out the window of their East Bay house. Could we have the East Bay house, Fiona? Fiona's going to put that up. A very large, elegant house that Angelina was born in. And out the back of that house, there was a garden and there was the kitchen where the enslaved people prepared the meals. And there was the stable where the horses were. So everything was out back where many of the enslaved people were working. And their mother used to lean out the window and yell insults at some of the people who were doing the work out there, much to Angelina's humiliation. So, they had negative feelings about the things their parents did to the enslaved people they owned. But that isn't the same as believing that slavery is a sin. So in other words, their reactions were visceral, emotional, uncomfortableness. They felt sympathy sometimes when they saw the suffering, but that's not the same thing as seeing that slavery should no longer be done. Yeah. So Angelina, as a devout Christian, believed that you should treat enslaved people with kindness because it would cause them to be better workers. That was as far as she got before she read the Quaker writings.
So interesting. So hard to imagine growing up in that world and witnessing all of those things. And that was regular life for anyone who would have lived in this time in that situation. I mean, the Grimkes were very wealthy and somewhat different than everyone in Charleston, but yeah. So talk a little bit about this turning point when they really arrive at this moment of just of decision, where leaving Charleston, leaving their family and becoming Quakers and joining the Society of Friends in Philadelphia. What a momentous moment, and what caused each of them to do that and take that step. That's a lot of change, considering the limitations on their lives and the kind of world they lived in. This is quite remarkable step to take, I think.
So what happened was that their father, a judge, became seriously ill and eventually was sent by his doctor to Philadelphia, where there were, top-notch doctors, to see if they could help him become healthy again. And we don't know what the disease was. And he invited Sarah, one of his daughters, he had many daughters, to accompany him on this trip. And this was in 1819, and Sarah was 27 years old.
27, okay.
I think. 27. So that took her to Philadelphia for the first time, and Philadelphia had a large Quaker community. They boarded at a Quaker house. The doctor who her father went to was married to a Quaker. And that was the beginning of Sarah's exposure to it, but she didn't approve of Quakers at all until she met 3 Quaker men on the boat back from Charleston after her father had died. He died about 2 or 3 months after they went up there, and then she remained a couple more months visiting relatives and enjoying the city, though she grieved his loss greatly. But on the boat back from Charleston, from Philadelphia to Charleston, there were 3 Quaker men, and she struck up a conversation with them, and they were very interested in her interest in Quakerism. So they paid her a visit while they were in Charleston. They brought books for her to read, and she was receptive. And that was the beginning of her understanding. There was a Quaker meeting in Charleston, but it was very small, and all the people who had been slave owners as Quakers had left the Quaker faith in Charleston because they wanted to continue owning slaves after 1780, when this branch of the Quaker faith declared you could not be a member of the Society of Friends that own slaves. So the Quakers were way ahead of their time in that, and that meant that the meeting in Charleston shrank dramatically after that decision. So there was really hardly any contact between aristocrats like the Grimkes and the Quaker meeting, which was tiny, and nobody thought anything of it really. It was they disdained Quakers. Of course, why? Because of their views about slavery. So Sarah was being very bold in even exploring Quaker readings because Quakers were disdained by the Southern aristocrats. Eventually, she realized this was the faith she wanted to join. She was attracted to the man, one of the 3 men who gave her the books, Israel Morris. He said she could come visit. He was recently widowed. So up she goes to Philadelphia, and that's where she stays for a number of years without returning home. And until she returns home in 1820. No, I'm not getting these dates right anymore. 1827 for the first time. So from 1821 to 1827, she doesn't go home.
Yeah.
And that's how she joins the Society of Friends. The footnote to this is that she had already conceived of the idea of becoming a minister when she was born again as a Presbyterian, though she didn't join the church. And that was when she thought God was calling her to be a minister, but there was no way for her to be a minister in any of the available denominations. So when she learned that women were ministers in the Quaker faith, that definitely was a part of the appeal as well.
Yeah.
Angelina was exposed to
Quaker faith on many levels for her. Yeah.
Angelina was exposed to Quakerism through Sarah. And when Sarah came back in 1827, Angelina disdained her Quakerism, just like any good Charlestonian would. But Sarah brought with her a minister, a prominent English Quaker minister, who gave a public address in Charleston and blew Angelina away because she had never seen a woman speak in public in her entire life. And, there was none doing it. So and then Angelina experienced this desire also to become a minister once she knew Quakers could be ministers. So it was both the sinfulness of slavery and the opportunity to pursue ministry. And so Angelina eventually moved to Philadelphia as well in 1829.
Yeah, and do they ever go back and live in Charleston again, or either one of them ever, is that home, or if they left permanently at that point? Both
They
of
knew they had both left permanently. The
Yeah.
question is, did they visit? Sarah visited her mother, who, they were very devoted to their mother, as any properly raised daughters were expected to be. And Sarah visited several times between 1827 and 1833. Angelina never visited again.
Hmm.
But she went much later than Sarah to the north. So,
Right.
and then after they became abolitionists, they could not go home.
Yeah, right. Yep. So talk about another turning point. They leave Philadelphia. We've jumped ahead in the story, so if you want to fill in a gap, but they leave they leave the Quaker community, and they become traveling anti-slavery lecturers. This progression continues of these moments where they're exploring. So talk a little bit about that. What happens? How do they get from one turning point to another? And when does that happen? How long after they've gone north?
So the one thing that I am trying to be clear about in my own mind and in the book is that they did not leave the Quaker faith when they left Philadelphia.
Oh, okay.
But the sisters' lives in Philadelphia,
They
this will
leave the
shock.
community, but not the faith. That they're leaving
They,
the community.
they leave the Philadelphia Quaker community, right?
Right. Okay. Sorry.
The sisters' experience of Quakerism, it will kind of shock people who have an impression of Quakerism the way Quakers are in the 20th century, which is, serious, committed pacifists, committed to civil rights, all these progressive ideas. But the Quaker faith in the 19th century was not, there were always people of the Quaker faith who had more progressive ideas than most other people, i.e., they decided no one could be a Quaker and own slaves after 1790 in the Philadelphia region. That was pretty darn progressive, but it took them a long time to get there. And after that, they dropped the issue of opposing the practice of slavery. The reasons are complicated, but basically in Philadelphia, the most prominent Quakers were all quite wealthy. They had become wealthy as tradespeople who made a lot of money in a booming economic era. And their clients were in the South. They sold their products to the plantation owners. And so it was in their best interest to not go on the attack against their own customers' practices. And so they became more conservative in their views. They never believed that slavery was a good thing, but they weren't about to go to bat against it anymore.
Yeah.
So that bothered the sisters continually, but it was sort of like, well, what's there to be done? The issue for them, there were several issues, but in terms of giving them an option to work on slavery, the eruption of the immediate anti-slavery movement was the key event for them historically. People are shaped by their time. So the sisters were ready to do something about slavery, but they didn't know what to do. So they were really deeply morose and grieving about the fact that seemed to be no solution. And then the immediate abolition movement came along, which was very different than the first movement to end slavery, which was called the gradual abolition movement. And gradual abolition was state by state, every state in the North, mostly all but a few, ended slavery over decades by saying, if you were born after the date this law's passed, then when you turn 18, 20, 21, whatever the law said, you will be free. So anyone who was enslaved at the time the law was passed was never going to be free. This was gradual abolition.
Yeah.
They instead died in slavery. So the immediate abolition movement said, wait a second, this is insane. No one should be enslaved one more day. It was a moral imperative. It wasn't a plan, because what could they do? The states in the South had rejected gradual abolition. They didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And so the North was upset, but they didn't know how to get to the South to get them to change their state laws. And so the idea of immediate abolition was, we need to speak to you as Christians. You are sinning right now. you need to stop sinning. You need to make sure your soul goes to heaven. You need to end slavery, the practice of slavery, because it is not God, ordered. It is against the golden rule. It is against what Jesus believed. Love everyone as yourself. So that's what immediate abolition was. It wasn't a plan. It was a moral imperative to the slaveholders. And the challenge became how to reach the slaveholders whose ideas about Christianity were very different. So that was one thing that pried the sisters out of Philadelphia, was the immediate anti-slavery movement began to grow, and they began to do the readings in the literature. They learned more and more about it. They had thought at first that it was written in favor of violence. And as pacifists and Quakers, they would never embrace a movement that believed in arousing the slaves to revolt, which was what the Quakers told each other and what Northern pro-slavery sympathizers told everybody else. This was a deep belief that the immediate abolitionists were trying to organize slave revolts. That was a total myth. It was fake news promoted by the slaveholding community in order to prevent the movement from catching on. When the sisters started reading the books and found out these guys are pacifists, they're not trying to organize slave revolts, they believe owning slaves is a sin, they believe in the golden rule, then they said, okay, we can join this. So that was a major part of how they finally left Philadelphia Quakers.
Yeah.
However,
where did they go? Where's the hotbed?
Wait a sec. The other thing is that they were increasingly disgusted by Orthodox Quakerism. And this is relevant to the
Orthodox Quakerism. Yeah.
The Quakers split in 1827 between the Hicksites and the Orthodox. And everyone thinks the Hicksites were these liberal progressives, but that's not true. They were just as regressive in many ways as the Orthodox, but the Orthodox were the much more evangelical wing, and the sisters fit there. But they were also the wealthier wing, the snobbier wing, and it's a long story, I won't go into it, but the sisters, the evangelical Christianity the sisters brought to Quakerism, they found less and less being practiced in Orthodox Quakerism in terms of, preaching about conversion, right? Because the Quakers are really not into conversion. It sort of happens in your own prayer moments, but it isn't one event. But evangelical Christians think you have to really convert and admit your sinfulness. That was not there, and that bothered Sarah especially. And they were too tolerant of their own sins. They were wealthy people. They were elite people. They weren't going out and bringing the message to other Christians. The Quakers didn't convert others. So and Sarah was severely condemned when she stood in meeting to preach. And so her ambitions to become a minister were entirely thwarted for reasons it's too complicated to explain. And then Angelina never even tried to rise in meeting because she saw how persecuted Sarah was by the elders who criticized her, which was their job, but she was being persecuted. So there were both reasons brought them forth out of Philadelphia. It was not a fit with the Quaker faith anymore, and the immediate abolition movement looked like something they could join and do something about slavery through, and that was really important.
Yeah.
So what happened? Angelina joined the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society the year after, more than a year after it was formed, because she heard speakers. She was always searching. And Sarah was like, I can't risk my ministerial career. I can't identify as an immediate abolitionist. But Angelina never really launched her career, so she was willing to risk disapproval. Eventually, Sarah became really frustrated as a minister, and Angelina was she didn't want to be in Philadelphia anymore. So Sarah was afraid she was going to lose Angelina. And at the same time, Angelina had all this pent up passion as a writer and thinker about what she wanted to say to the South to bring them into the immediate abolition movement and free their slaves. And so she began working on an essay to send to the American Anti-Slavery Society. But I forgot to say that in May of that year, they'd both gone to the East Coast to attend some Quaker yearly meetings, and they met a bunch of abolitionists. Angelina renewed her friendship with Garrison. And so the process of Angelina's closing connection to the abolitionists happened in May in the East Coast before they came back to Philadelphia. And they were both free of Philadelphia by July. So it's
What year
too
was that
complicated
again,
to
Lucy?
boil down into a single narrative in 5 seconds. But
Yeah, it's a lot of material.
you have to read the book. What can I
Yeah,
say?
we're gonna have to read the book. What year was all of that going on? What year, May of
Well,
what?
Angelina joined the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society in 1835. And by the
Wow.
summer of 1836, Sarah had abandoned her ministerial career in Philadelphia, not elsewhere.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
Angelina was starting to write this essay. And she'd already been invited by a Quaker to come speak to Quakers. And now the American Anti-Slavery Society sent her a letter and said, will you speak to other Quakers? And that way they were hoping to hook her that way. And of course, it turned out she spoke to anyone, and so did Sarah eventually.
yeah, yeah. It's such a fascinating, um, you know, the evolution of an activist and how something is felt very personally, and then how they don't stop with the personal and how they move out of themselves and find a way. I find it, watching it happen, so interesting to just even observe, even from a time long ago, how they each come to that. It's really such an interesting thing. I've seen it more, you know, in Willard and people who are a little bit later, but this sort of sets the stage. You can see um, how they're developing. So maybe talk about their involvement in the, you know, what are those initial activist moves? What does that look like for each of them as they really start to recognize themselves as anti-slavery activists? And this becomes, they've now seen the way. So what are their first things? They're writing, they're speaking, like they're doing conventions. Like, what's going on in that early anti-slavery time as this is getting formed as a movement, really, or the immediate anti-slavery movement?
Well, yeah, I'd like to stick within our theme of faith too.
Yeah,
So I think what I might do is talk a little bit about this essay that Angelina wrote that the American Anti-Slavery Society then published,
yeah,
because it was a very Christian essay, and it was the way she understood, and Sarah too, both understood their joining the immediate abolition movement, is that they were doing it because of their Christian faith.
yeah,
And so Angelina writes about the golden rule in this essay, and she directly asks the readers, who she directs this essay to Christian women of the South, and she says to them, would you be willing to be a slave? Would you be willing for your children to be slaves? She's talking, and she brings up the golden rule. So this is deep in her understanding of what she's doing. She's trying to help slave owners take their own Christianity more seriously. Her faith was the vehicle by which she hoped to persuade them, because they were Christians too.
yeah,
And I think it's a mistake to see her, in later years, many people take on activism without religious dimension to their motivation. However, I would have to say that for I don't know, how do I say this? I mean, there are lots of, and I have to say, I'm not a devout Christian. Let me just get that on the table. But I'm interested in how Christianity motivates people powerfully to do remarkable activist work. And it is actually consistent across the 20th century. I mean, I was listening to Brian Stevenson, the amazing founder of the Legacy Museum and the anti-lynching museum. And I'm not
yeah,
using the right words, but in Mississippi, and his everything about what he does is deeply motivated by his Christian faith. Now, he doesn't package it too apparently that way, but it's all in there. It's absolutely the idea that all humanity should be loved and respected and treated equally. That's also in Christianity. Just because a lot of Christians don't practice it doesn't mean it isn't in there potentially to motivate activism. And so the sisters join a very devout movement. I mean, most
yeah,
of the
yeah,
leaders of the anti-slavery movement are ministers who also are coming to their activism through their faith. And so the sisters go to be trained in New York in 1836, and they're the only women there. They have to debate and vote on whether they're going to let the sisters speak in the meeting, because the tradition is that men's meetings, women don't speak, women don't even come. And
Yeah.
so this was the first breakthrough, with that the vote was, yes, we want you to speak. Well, of course, they were experts on what slavery was. They had lived in amongst slavery. As Angelina put it, she was brought up in the evil of slavery, on the evil of slavery. So they had an extra motivation for letting the women speak, which was they had experts in the room. Yeah. But they eventually were launched as agents to go travel around and speak to anyone who came. It started off being just for women, because those were the rules of the day. No man could listen to a woman speak, or ought to, because if a man's gaze in public was on a woman's body, it sexualized her and made her like a prostitute, ethically speaking. So the idea was no man should watch a woman give a speech in public. Obviously, the Quakers didn't believe this, but that was the popular view. And so when the sisters started speaking, they were only speaking to women. More and more women came, and then men started sneaking in. And the sisters said, because they were used to men and women being in the audiences where a woman minister would speak. So it wasn't a shocker to them. Their Quaker experience really contributed to their willingness to break that barrier.
Yeah. It's such a rich story, and there's so much to tell. And I'm looking at the time, and I want to be sure we have time for questions. Do you want to show any of the other photographs? I'm particularly.
Oh, right. I forgot.
The Bibles, Lucy.
Fiona, could you do Art Street Meeting?
Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
This is the Quaker meeting where the sisters worshiped. And to the left, you see what are called the facing benches. Those benches are where the elders and the ministers sat. They were the most powerful, prominent people in the meeting house. And then the women sat on one side of the meeting house, and the men sat on the other side. And then similarly, the balconies were teenage boys and teenage girls, kept very separate. Fiona, could you show the Negro bench? Yeah, this is where the very few African-American people who attended Arch Street meeting, the sisters meeting, were permitted to sit. They were friends of the sisters, Sarah Douglas and her mother, Grace Douglas. They were not allowed to join. The Quakers would not permit African-Americans to join as members, but they were allowed to come to meeting, which was deeply hurtful to Grace Douglas, who was raised as a Quaker. But she faithfully came, and sometimes, they eventually were moved to a longer bench at the very back. And sometimes Quakers would come up white Quakers would try and come up and sit with them. And so they positioned someone nearby to sort of prevent white Quakers from sitting on the Negro bench. So they became very dear friends with Sarah Douglas for the rest of their lives. And that's a whole nother story. And then the Bibles, Fiona. The left-hand Bible was Angelina's Bible, and it's very, very large. It was an Orthodox Quaker Bible, and she was a real Bible scholar, and so she took tons of notes in the margins, which is really fun to look at. This is my photograph. And then on the right is the tiny, tiny Sarah Grimke Bible, where there were no margins to write in. The print I couldn't read it, even with glasses on. I don't know how she did it. And this picture was taken in the home of Angelina's great-great-grandson. And they had yet to donate these to the archives that holds the Grimke papers. So I got to see them in their home. It was so exciting.
And who's in the portrait, the little oval there?
Yeah, the oval is of their mother, Mrs. Grimke, when she was quite young. And she was came from one of the very wealthy families in Charleston. Her father was a banker, descended from Puritans on both sides of the family, named Smith, and related to Abigail Adams, who was a Smith, that branch settled in the North.
Wow.
So they're Puritan settling in Charleston is too. And anyway, she was very glamorous, as you can see from her very fancy hairdo.
Yeah.
But she was a very vicious slave owner, let me tell you.
Yeah, really.
So let's take some questions. We don't want
Yeah, I can see a couple of them here. So let me see if I can.
to. Angelina did marry. Sarah
Oh
did not.
yeah, you can see them too. Go ahead, Lucy.
Sarah had was proposed to by Israel Morris, who, let me tell you, we have a photograph of him in later years. He was incredibly handsome guy. I mean, really, his charisma comes across in the photograph.
Huh.
And he wooed Sarah for years. And she was afraid that if she married him, she would put him before God. And she fended him off.
Wow.
She married him. And he was a widower with children, and he was probably a pretty patriarchal guy. And I think she sensed that. Angelina had several marriage proposals. The first one came from a very prominent, wealthy young Quaker man who became ill and died. And if she had married him, her entire life would have been different, because she would have had to have been a very proper Quaker, and because he was so prominent. And she realized later it was very lucky she didn't marry him. And then she met at the training I was describing, one of the leading lecturers of the immediate abolition movement, Theodore Weld, and they fell in love at first sight. And that's because they had both read each other's letters in the Liberator the year before and fallen in love with each other at that time, actually.
Yeah.
This is actually documentable. So, and he was extremely charismatic and a very brilliant speaker. And she eventually married him.
Did she have children? Did they have children?
She had 3 children.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So there are descendants. Is that where the Bibles are? Is that one of their Angelina's
A
descendants?
descendant of one of their children, right? They had 2 of their children had children, one didn't. So, and I've gotten in touch with all the descendants.
Interesting.
Which is kind of
Where
fun.
are all those papers? I just had a quick question. Where is everything that you've been?
Papers are at Clements Library at the University of Michigan. And that's because the daughter of Theodore and Angelina married a man from Michigan and raised her family in Michigan, and her descendants were in Michigan, and they attended the university. These are all such great questions.
I know.
I will be answering every single one of them in my book. How did they support themselves? Let me say, they were very rich when they had inherited money because they were from a rich family. They owned stocks and bonds. They had, investments, and then they lived off the income. So they were fine until Angelina married Theodore. Sarah went to live with him, and then he started spending all the money on farms that never produced. But Angelina's money, Sarah wouldn't let him touch her money. But they were quite wealthy and didn't need to earn a living until they married. I say they married Theodore, and then they became kind of poverty stricken because the money went to buying, land and farms that didn't produce income. Sarah hoarded her money, but they never wanted to live richly anyway. When they became Quakers, they became devout Quakers, plain dressing, plain speaking Quakers. There were rich Quakers. Israel Morris was one of them, but the sisters lived a very parsimonious life. They tried to eat simple food. That was part of their discipline. So they never wanted to live fancy again. They were horrified at how they had formerly lived, and they didn't. So personality of the sisters. Sarah was a very sympathetic, loving, kind, tenderhearted person. Angelina was much more of an intellectual. Sarah would have been a judge. She was very careful in reaching her conclusions. Angelina would have been a prosecutor. She was ready to make an argument and clinch the deal. She was fearless intellectually. She followed arguments to their logical conclusion. Sarah was the institutionalist. She really wanted to be part of this Quaker community as a minister, and it broke her heart that they would not really let her in. So they each had strengths. Angelina was probably a little bit cold-hearted. She was not naturally affectionate. She was intellectual, I would say. And Sarah was. So Sarah was much closer to the children than Angelina was, which became a sore point.
Yeah, what did you think? Several of the comments are about the book Invention of Wings that a lot of
Oh,
people
right.
have
So,
read. It was a
right.
interesting fictional account of their life.
So Suma Kidd wrote The Invention of Wings. It was around 2010 or 11. And no, maybe it was 2014. And she was very drawn to Sarah's spiritualism and the diaries, but she, of course, was a novelist. So she let her fancy take flight and invented a whole lot of stuff to make a compelling story. And so Sarah is supposedly corresponding with the person who had been enslaved to wait on her and care for her since their childhoods, none of which was true. And then Kidd invents a whole nother narrative about, Nat Turner and all sorts of connections that never
Right,
existed.
in Charleston.
She also, when she gets them to Philadelphia, she has them immediately becoming friends with Lucretia Mott, which was not the case. And there's a lot of fiction in the stories. I really credit Suma Kidd for bringing the Grimkes to attention of a whole new generation.
Yeah.
I probably got my book contract because of that. I got my great agent because of that. Because the book was so popular that publishers who want to know if there's a market thought, oh, there must be a market. So I'm very grateful to her for doing that. But as a historian, of course, I'm eager to tell the true story. So, for example, the father's painted as a kindly man to the enslaved people he owns, and that's not the case. But Suma Kidd wanted a little balance because the mother was clearly a nasty slave owner, so she made the father kind, but it wasn't true.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma. We want those stories to be told, but in a fictional account, you just aren't going to be able, you've got to take that narrative license really in order to piece the story together in some ways. So, yeah.
Well, if you're writing fiction, absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
And why not make it as good as you can make it? You're free.
Yeah. Yeah.
I see there's a question here about other books recommended about the sisters, and I have to say, there aren't any. I mean, since Gerda Lerner's book, there's been something by Mark Perry that was about 3 generations, and it looks like it's historically grounded in its footnotes, but it's actually highly fictionalized as well. And he relies on unreliable sources for his footnotes, and many things he claims. He's a novelist also. Many things he claims are not true. And there's one book about Angelina called The Emancipation of Angelina Grimke, but it's pretty biased because the author was a sociologist who totally identified with Angelina because the author didn't like her older sister, so she projects a lot onto Angelina.
Oh God.
So these books are problematic. So there hasn't been historians writing about the Grimkes since Gerda Lerner, and I've discovered there's just a lot of errors in Gerda Lerner's for a lot of complicated reasons I won't go into. So my book
it's really going to be amazing. When do you think it's coming out, Lucy? What's the expected timeline?
The book keeps getting longer and longer. I'm now on I've just finished chapter 14 of 17 chapters. I now believe that the book will be published in 2024, in the fall of 2024.
Yay. So 3 years.
You can all, if I may make a pitch, you can all go to my website, louisewknight.com, if you want to sign up for notification about when the book's coming out, because there's a little form, if you scroll down a little bit, where you can put your name and email in, and then I will be sending out communications to people, first of all, about when the book's coming out, and second of all, about events, book talks and things. So I would love it if you would sign up on the website.
Yeah, this has been really, really so interesting. And one of the things that one of the reasons why we wanted to do this talk and do this series is to really sort of really look at the importance of religion and faith in these people's lives, because it really was such an integral part of their daily life in ways that it's very hard for us to, or many of us, not all of us, but many of us, to imagine in our 21st century world. So I think it sort of reimagining this story and understanding this, how their faith really was such a motivating part of their activism is the whole idea. And it's not something that we often hear about, except for in sort of more controversial ways, let's say, today. So anyway, thanks so much, Lucy. Do you have anything else? Go to franceswillardhouse.org too. Take a little time once we're done talking and visit both these places, both Lucy's website and our website, and
Can I just
more
thank everyone for coming? I thank you so much for being interested in the Grimke sisters and for catching this slice of trying to pack a whole book into, you know.
I know.
I really am grateful to all of you for coming.
Yeah. Thanks.
And yes, Bonnie, I will put a link to this video up on my website.
Yeah.
Oh,
and
I think she's asking if you could put my website up in the chat link. But maybe we're ending, so that's okay.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone. Stay tuned, connect with us. You'll hear more about this series, and we'll keep moving forward in time, exploring this in the later 19th and then early 20th century too, this theme. So
thank you, Lori. Thank you so much.
Lucy.
And thank you, Fiona.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.